So, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, John Kerry from Temple Old Kirk Friends. And John's going to be talking to us about Temple Old Kirk, Templars and treasure hunts. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Susan. Could I have the next slide, please? This is a view of Temple Village in Midlothian, painted by Sir William Gillis in 1968 from the front window of his house. It's currently on view at the City Art Gallery in Edinburgh. Temple is an extremely small village. In the early years of the 20th century, it was made up almost entirely of shops. People living and farming in the Morfoot Hills used to come down this road every week and get their supplies here. The shop you see on the left is now a private house, and it's where I live. Next one. Soon after I came to live in Temple, there was growing concern in the village about the condition of Temple Old Kirk. Temple Old Kirk is a late medieval parish church situated in a beautiful wooded valley beside the South Esk River at the north end of the village. It was built over the foundations of the Church of the Knights Templar Preceptory of Ballintroduch. Next. Ballintroduch, the settlement of the warriors, was effectively the headquarters of the Knights Templar operation in Scotland from the early 12th century till the dissolution of the order in 1312. The order had been established to protect the pilgrim routes to the Holy Land in the aftermath of the First Crusade. King David I granted them substantial estates here. Next one. Temple Old Kirk itself was probably built in the late 14th century, no doubt using some of the masonry of the dismantled Knights Templar Preceptory. It's been owned by Midlothian Council since the 1920s, and the council carried out some conservation work in the 1980s, but by 2020, the membrane which should have prevented water from penetrating the walls had perished, and as you can see, several vigorous saplings were now growing out of the walls. Next one. There had been a fall of masonry inside the building, you can see on the left, and there appeared to be a danger of another more serious fall. Midlothian Council had no money to spend on another campaign of repairs, so a group of villagers decided to form a charity, Temple Old Kirk Friends, to supervise the conservation of the building. Next one. When we started to try and raise interest and concern about the plight of Temple Old Kirk, we soon realised that it was the Templar angle that a lot of people were most interested in. This was inconvenient, as we, Temple Old Kirk Friends, were more interested in the conservation of a beautiful late medieval parish church and its graveyard. However, the historical significance of the site was undeniable, so we decided to try and turn it to our advantage. Next. The Knights Templar saw themselves as warrior monks and prided themselves on their bravery in battle. But although as individuals the Templars had taken a vow of poverty, the order itself rapidly became extremely rich. Next. A papal decree exempted them from paying taxes. Soon they were not only protecting pilgrims travelling to and from the Holy Land, but also ensuring that they had funds to live on when they got there. They effectively became the first international bankers. They lent money to many of the crowned heads of Europe, in particular to the kings of France. Next. But by the end of the 13th century, the last Christian warriors had been expelled from the Holy Land. Opportunities for pilgrimage were at an end, and there was no longer any justification for the Templars' existence. Philip IV of France saw the chance of evading his debt to them by arresting their leaders on largely trumped-up charges. Many of the French Templars were put to death, and Pope Clement officially dissolved the order in 1312. Next. In England and Scotland, the suppression of the Knights Templar was accompanied by less brutality. In Scotland, as elsewhere, Templar lands were granted to the Order of the Knights Hospitaller, who administered them from their own preceptory at Torficum in West Lothian. At Temple, the preceptory of the Knights Templar fell into decay and was pillaged for dressed stone for use on nearby buildings. Next. Extraordinarily little evidence survives of the Templars' years at Ballintroduch. In 2006, a stone grave slab marked with a simple cross was discovered during the rebuilding of the wall between the Old Kirk graveyard and the Old Manse. This is thought to date from Templar times. Next. Perhaps the most interesting recent find is this heraldic mount from a horse's harness recovered in 2018. It's in very poor condition, but Dr. Alice Blackwell of National Museum Scotland is confident that it carries the coat of arms of John, Earl of Richmond. Next. John, Earl of Richmond, was a close and trusted relative of King Edward I of England. His best documented presence in Scotland relates to the campaigns of 1298 to 1300, soon after the start of the Wars of Scottish Independence. Part of his role was to deal with the Templars in Scotland. He may well have been involved in the transfer of the Knights Templar estates to the Knights Hospitaller following the suppression of the Order of Knights Templar in the years following 1307. Next. High up in the belfry of the Old Kirk is a stone which is thought to date from soon after the Order of Knights Templar was finally dissolved in 1312. This is confusing, as the belfry is a late addition to the fabric of the Old Kirk, added around 1630, so the stone must originally have been placed elsewhere. Next. The lead-filled inscription, we go back one. The lead-filled inscription has been interpreted as the Sacred Council of Vienne to the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem and of Malta, referring to the Council of 1312, by which the lands of the Knights Templar were granted to the Order of Knights Hospitaller. Next one. When it was originally built, probably in the late 14th century, Temple Old Kirk was a simple rectangular box, slightly smaller than the building we know today, but several features of this original building still survive. Next. Among them is the tomb recess on the north wall near the altar. We don't know whose effigy lay in this recess, but it would almost certainly have been destroyed at the Reformation. Next. On the south wall are the remains of two sedilia, seats for visiting clergy to use during a service. They were almost always on the south wall of a church beside the altar, as they are here. Next. Nearby is the recess which would have held a piscina, a basin with a drain where communion vessels were washed and unused communion wine was disposed of. Next. The east window over the altar may have contained stained glass, but virtually all stained glass in Scotland was destroyed at the Reformation. After 1560, in temples elsewhere in Scotland, parish churches were adapted to serve the requirements of the new religion, so the altar and much of the furniture associated with Catholicism was thrown out. The pulpit and the repentance stool became the most important articles of furniture. Next. The stool of repentance, also known as the cutty stool or the creepy, was a seat used for the public penance of those who had offended against the morality of the time, usually by drunkenness, adultery, or fornication. At the end of a service, the offender usually had to stand on the stool to receive the rebuke of the minister. The coming of the stool of repentance was not universally welcomed at Temple. There are records of it having been taken out of the church and burned in Temple churchyard on more than one occasion. Next. At the time of the Reformation, the lands around Temple were still owned and administered by the Knights Hospitaller from their headquarters at Torficon. With commendably smart footwork, in 1563, the preceptor of Torficon, Sir James Sandilands, yielded the lands of the Knights Hospitaller to Mary Queen of Scots, then promptly bought them back from her as a private individual for a knockdown price, receiving the title of Lord Torficon as part of the deal. Next. A few years later, he sold the lands on to George Dundas of Dundas Castle in West Lothian. It was the descendants of George and his wife Catherine who were to become prominent in Scottish politics throughout the 18th century, based on the fine house at Arniston built for them by William Adam. Next. After William and Mary came to the throne in 1689, Presbyterianism was once again accepted as the established form of religion in Scotland, and the oldest gravestone at Temple Old Kirk dates from this same year. It shows a flying soul and an hourglass with the skull, crossbones, and the sexton's tools below. Next. Another fine early gravestone at Temple is this one, dated 1691. which shows memento mori symbols and a workman's tools, which may be those of a blacksmith or a slater. Next. Perhaps the best-known headstone at Temple commemorates John Craig, a farmer in Utiston, a mile up the road towards the Morford Hills. Next. This stone was a particular favourite of Betty Wilshire, the patron saint of lovers of Scottish gravestones. It's worth quoting her description in full. A striking portrait of a farmer and his two little sons. This gravestone commemorates John Craig, a local tenant farmer at Utiston, who died in 1742, aged 68. Next. Presumably, this fine carved portrait is of John himself, clad in typical mid-18th century dress, probably his church-going clothes. He stands protectively over two small boys, both well-dressed, who represent his sons. Next. The minister at Temple in the latter part of the 18th century was John Goldie. He died on the 18th of August, 1788, and is buried here beneath a headstone inscribed in Latin. He was succeeded as minister of Temple by his son James. Next. By this time, the fabric of Temple Old Kirk was showing its age, and James Goldie petitioned vigorously for a new church to be built. This was finally opened in 1832, just across the road from the old kirk. Next. James Goldie himself died on Christmas Eve 1847, having been minister at Temple for 58 years. He's commemorated by this obelisk just beside his father's grave in the corner of the churchyard. James Goldie was unmarried and had no descendants. Unusually, the inscription on his obelisk lists his many bequests. Next. 2 years after James Goldie's death, James Drummond came to Temple and did this drawing of the old kirk gently crumbling away in its graveyard. Drummond's drawing shows a certain artistic license. Of the steep slope of Shilling Hill, which from this angle would be visible directly behind the old kirk, there's no sign, and James Goldie's obelisk has been shifted to the centre of the composition. Next one. The person responsible for removing the roof of the old kirk was Robert Dundas. Robert had been concerned that village children had taken to playing inside the kirk and worried that the roof was unsafe. His diary is an interesting document. He mentions several explosions that took place in the gunpowder works at Stobbs and Roslin, but is somewhat reticent about the many accidents and fatalities that took place in the Arniston coal mines, which his family owned. Next.
2 minutes to go, John.
The only memorial to a coal miner at Temple is rather elegant. It was erected by John Paterson, James Somerville, and Robert Paterson, coal hewers in Whitehill, to the memory of Thomas Paterson, who died in 1740. Next. On the reverse is a beautiful carved set of miners' tools, including pick, shovel, wedges, and a compass for finding your way around about underground. Next. During his lifetime, Robert Dundas took care of the old kirk and tried to ensure that it didn't deteriorate excessively. But after he died in 1909, no one seemed to have looked after it. Next. In 1928, the ownership passed to Midlothian Council, and some 50 years later they carried out some long overdue repairs, but only with the establishment of Temple Old Kirk Friends in 2020 was any effort made to develop a coherent conservation strategy. Next. In spite of COVID, we conducted a comprehensive survey of the graveyard under the watchful eye of Andy Jepson of Adopt a Monument. Next. We're currently producing a complete online database of all our surviving monuments and inscriptions to aid those looking for ancestors buried at Temple. Next. We've held a number of open days and regularly join Midlothian Doors Open in September to offer conducted tours of the site. We also organise regular visits for our supporters to neighbouring graveyards. And a couple of weeks ago, we organised a treasure hunt in Temple Old Kirk Graveyard. Next. Much more importantly, we retain the services of a highly experienced conservation architect who's commissioned a skilled stonemason to carry on a programme of emergency repairs, which will ensure that Temple Old Kirk is no longer in danger of falling down. Next. We've spent well over £100,000, but there's a great deal still to do. Apart from a lot more work on the old kirk, stabilising the windows and repointing, we want to reinstate some of the paths shown on the 1870s plan, so the site is more accessible to wheelchair users. Next. We want to cut back the hedge of yews at the edge of the Southwest River Valley so they don't continually drip on the gravestones below. Next. And we want to restore some of our beautiful gravestones. We've had an estimate of John Kerry, and he'd alone cost £15,000 to fully conserve. That was 3 years ago, and now it would certainly be more. Next. And finally, we don't have many interesting epitaphs at Temple, but I have a fondness for this one, which I'll leave you with. It commemorates members of the Finlayson family who, like the Craigs, were local farmers, as you can tell by the carving of a plough on their headstone. Next. It reads, "Lo, here we do erect this stone to let our burial ground be known, that when our bodies come to die, we amongst kindred dust may lie." Next. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. That was utterly fascinating for you to take us through those kind of hundreds of years of really interesting history.
Hope I didn't overrun too much.
No, you did not. And I take my hat off to you, because that was, I think, 48 slides within 15 minutes. So that was brilliant. That was absolutely splendid. I don't think that we have any questions just yet from the floor. So I am going to ask you a very quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say sometimes it's really difficult, isn't it, when you find that people bring a very strong interest, a very strong particular interest in a graveyard to the site. And so I wondered whether you could share with us whether there had been a kind of sense locally of whether the Templar collection was a kind of blessing or a curse in terms of encouraging people to visit.
That's a difficult one, actually. When I came to the village in 2014, and people were still recalling their experiences in the 1980s, when Midlothian Council realised that the old kirk was in pretty bad condition, and a group of people who called themselves Knights Templar. And when I put it like that, I'm not trying to be snide or anything, but there are a lot of people of different groups who call themselves Knights Templar. And this particular group wanted to have the ownership of the old kirk made over to them, which the council was prepared to do. And it was only because of a lot of opposition within the village that they were in fact frustrated and forced in the end to restore the building themselves. At one stage, this particular group of Knights Templar erected a steel cross in the graveyard without planning permission, and the village was so cross that they went down there and uprooted it and threw it in the woods. I don't know precisely who actually was responsible, because there are different stories about this, and nobody quite agrees. But it was dramatic at the time. But also, I mean, there are groups who are very responsible, and in particular, a group who regularly give us money, and I'm extremely grateful for them, and they behave immaculately. So you can never quite tell. It's complicated.
Thank you, John. I think you've really put your finger on it there. It is very complicated, isn't it? Kind of managing all of the different stakeholder interests that there may be in a graveyard. And I have to say, I think that the Friends group at Temple are doing an absolutely marvelous job. And I feel that you are really celebrating and showcasing the various different histories which are connected to that space, and are not being overly burdened with just one story to tell for the site. So I think that, yeah, I really applaud the work you're doing. It's tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very kind.
Brilliant.